Good evening. I'm excited to see you all starting to show up on the webinar. If you would take an opportunity to introduce yourself in the chat box, tell us where you're from so that we will have a fun little map of where everybody is tuning in from today. Luke from Alabama is our first one in, representing the great region of 7. There's region 9. I'll never keep up now. That's fun. I think I see it. Have I seen every region? See a lot of region 6. Shout out to region 6. There's region 1. Region 10 for the win. Good job. Region 2. My home region. Region 5, region 10, region 8, region 12, region 4. I love that you guys are still hanging on to that.
Yes.
I hang on to region 4 as well. All right. That's so exciting to have you all here. Do we have any coaches that are able to join us tonight? We'd love to hear from you in the chat box. Hi, Christy Eskeland. Very good. There's our coaches. Wonderful. And some of our students even brought their mom with them. That's a good idea. I love that. Good job, Kat. That's exciting. We have a great registration for tonight. Some 260 some value participants, and that is exceptional. So thank you for tuning in. We are super excited. We're going to give you about 30 more seconds for folks to log in so that everybody is ready to get started and hear from this wonderful, very talented group of speakers that you're going to hear from tonight. All right, so welcome to Exploring the NCFCA Value Resolutions webinar. It's sponsored by our friends at the University of Northwestern St. Paul. My name is Kim Cromer, and I am honored to serve as the League's Executive Director. Tonight is a special night as we begin to dig into the 3 topics that have been chosen for this year's options. Certainly, we all wish that we were together celebrating at regional championships around the country, but we're grateful for the opportunity to be able to spend some time with this group of people who've been working diligently on your behalf for over 6 months. I'd like to start with a special thank you for the hard work and dedication of this team, and to introduce you to the chairman of our debate committee, Dr. Ravi Paul. Dr. Paul has been involved with NCFCA for 12 years and has served in various roles over the years, including the North Carolina State Rep, and he's currently a member of our board of directors. Ravi earned both his MS and PhD in industrial management from Clemson University, go Tigers, after completing his BS in mechanical engineering from Bangalore University. He serves as an associate professor of management information systems in the College of Business at East Carolina University. Ravi and his wife Nancy have 5 children, 3 NCFCA alumni, 1 that you're going to hear from tonight, a current competitor, and 1 future competitor. One interesting fact about Dr. Paul is that he speaks 5 languages. He does promise to keep it to 1 tonight. But Dr. Paul, please tell us about the resolution process and the goals of NCFCA value debate.
Sure will. Thanks, Kim. It's great to be here. Thank you all for taking time during this crazy time to join us. It is indeed exciting to be here and join y'all as we get started for the next year. Before I talk a little bit about the process we typically go through, I want to give a huge shout out to the team. You know, there are terms, we hear terms, we've seen perhaps a few sports teams that can claim the notion of having a dream team. I believe we have a dream team this year especially, I mean, on both sides, absolutely for sure. But today, in front of you, that's going to share with you on the LD. It has been absolutely my pleasure and joy and an honor to just work alongside these three amazing people with so much, not just knowledge, but and passion, but just incredible people that are very thoughtful and very caring about what we're going to do and what we're going to talk about as we go about figuring out what the resolutions are going to be. So first of all, thank you to Christy, Caleb, and Joel. You guys are amazing. Thank you for joining us today. So as far as the process is concerned, so typically what we start, it's kind of a little bit like a year-long, all around the year kind of thing. We start looking at topics, potential resolution topics, fairly early on. And we look at the ideas and suggestions that you guys send in as affiliates over the year, but also some of our own that we think might be good topics. And then we go through this multi-level, multi-step process of narrowing down the field from the, usually about 30 or 40 topics that we start with. And then we work our way down to the top 12, work our way down to the top 6, and then work our way down to the top 3, which is what we present to you guys at this time. So it's a pretty involved process. There's a lot of research that goes into it from the committee. There's a lot of discussion, some very engaging debates among the committee members. We want to make sure that we've kind of thought through this thoroughly before we submit it as potential options for you guys to vote on. So that's typically the process that we undertake. And it's a long process, it's an involved process, but it's also a very fun process that we enjoy working on during this time. So with that said, one of my goals is I present this to the committee at the beginning of this whole process, and my thought is, let's make sure we put 3 topics out for a vote that we would be excited if any one of those are chosen. So we don't want to present a topic to you that we're not excited about potentially winning and being the resolution that you guys debate for the rest of the year. So that's a sort of a standard that we put on there. But you should also know that we use several criteria that we use to filter these resolution topics ideas through during the whole process. Some of those are compatibility with NCFCA's mission, which is a primary criterion that every resolution topic that we put out has to meet. We look at potential relevance of the topic. We look at the breadth of the topic, variety of topic, and so on. Several of these were addressed by Mrs. Cromer in her newsletter, her last newsletter. If you haven't had a chance to look at that, please review that, and it'll give you a better idea of how we go about determining what topics make it to this list versus those that don't. Also, in the same token, please feel free to send any suggestions you have at any time during the year before we get to this point. You can send an email or suggestion to debatecommittee@ncfca.org, and we will look at all of those. They get put into a list that we start with for the next year. All right, so a couple of notes having presented the process. We are going to present the final wording for these topics early next week, prior to the closure on the voting, which is May 1st. So we want to make sure that we put the final wording for you, available to you, beginning of next week, so you have a chance to cogitate on that and think about it and process everything before you cast your final vote before May 1st. Also, there are white papers, if you haven't had a chance to look at those, on the NCFCA website. If you look under surveys on your dashboard, there is a white paper that talks a little more, goes into a little more depth on each of these three topics that we'll also be discussing today. So, start with the end in mind, right? So that's a general principle that we like to follow. I want to make sure that we understand that tonight's purpose for this webinar is to present more information about each topic. That's the purpose. We're trying to present more information. Rules or debate philosophies and things of that nature are not going to be discussed today. They will be reserved for another platform, another time. Speaking of purpose, I want to start off with a clear articulation of NCFCA's foundational principles when it comes to Lincoln-Douglas value debate. So we believe that value debate is, at its core, philosophical in nature. And it's most appropriate for students with the ability to handle philosophical, AKA abstract material. We want to provide students with a forum. You have to understand that these are forums for more mature, substantive, philosophical discourse. LD debate is about addressing the all-important why question. Why do we do the things that we do? Examples are in the sense of the word meant to illustrate principles, but are not principles in and of themselves. Nor do they prove the truth of principles. So the idea is, in Lincoln-Douglas value debate, we make philosophical arguments that must be supported by logic. The logic could be one's own logic in combination with the logic of philosophers and topic area experts that have spent their lifetimes thinking about this particular topic and trying to make arguments with that. So with that foundational element laid out, I want to just explain how this evening is going to go. So basically, each of our resolution committee members will give a short presentation for each of the topics that they've researched and developed the white paper for and thought about quite a bit. Once all three of them are done, we'll have a giveaway, fun, and then we'll have a time for Q&A for the panel. You are welcome to add questions to the panel in the chat box. And if you would, if the question is to be addressed to a specific panel member, please include their name as well with your question. That would be very helpful. All right, so basics are done. We're going to go ahead and get started with our panel, starting with none other than my friend, the chairman of the board, Mrs. Christy Shipe. Mrs. Shipe serves as the chairman of the board, the NCFCA board, and is also the author of both the NCFCA Comprehensive Guide to Team Policy Debate and the NCFCA Comprehensive Guide to Value Debate. Christy and her husband, Richard, have been married for 21 years. They have 5 children, all of which have competed in NCFCA. After being homeschooled through high school, Christy graduated summa cum laude with a BA in political science from Cedarville University in 1998, receiving the Edmund Burke Award for Social Sciences. She participated on the Cedarville debate team for 3 years and is the author of 2 additional debate textbooks and the producer of a companion video. Welcome, Christy. Floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Ravi. It's been a joy, just a real joy to work with you and the rest of the team, like you said. So my resolution is Resolved, in democratic elections, the public's right to know ought to be valued above a candidate's right to privacy. And I want to give you a little bit more information about this resolution, looking at its relevance, the breadth, kind of the meat of the resolution, where will the debate lie, and the supportability, really kind of look at what is the literature and how much material is there on this topic. So first, the relevance. As you probably already know, this is a national election year. So incredibly relevant, and obviously we live in a country with democratic elections. Much of the world has democratic elections. So this is very applicable, not only to in our own country, but also around the world. And especially, I think, for us living in the United States in an election year, it's a great topic. The right to privacy and the right of the public to know about candidates, I think, are both rights that most people cherish. So this, I think, will be an interesting debate between those two values, those two rights, where most people, like I think most people in our league would say, yes, people have the right to privacy, but yes, also the public needs to know information about candidates before they vote. And the right to privacy is especially relevant as we are in this digital age where everybody has a cell phone with a camera and the internet. You can type anything about anyone. Information is so accessible. So that's something unique to think about. And of course, the public right to know is a fundamental part of the idea of self-governance, of the people ruling in a democracy, or either way, whether you want to call it a democracy or republic, it's the same idea that where the people rule, where the government is vested in the people, then they need to know what the government is doing and about the candidates that they might elect. So that's a little bit about the relevance. Let me move into kind of the heart of the topic and just examine both of these, this public right to know and this candidate's right to privacy. First of all, I think something that this resolution brings up is just the question of what are rights. And there's a great place to start thinking about this is just the article on the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, which is available online for free. And it gives a great overview of just the idea of rights and what they are. And if you scroll to the end of that article, you'll see like more than 100 references to scholarly books and articles on this topic. The idea of rights is primarily a modern discussion. And by modern, I mean the last 200-300 years, primarily the last 200 years. It includes some robust discussion from some philosophers like Jeremy Bentham, Mill, Kant, many others, especially modern philosophers and political scientists. And there is disagreement among philosophers about where do rights come from, which rights exist, and all of those things. So that will be something interesting to think about. The foundations of the right of privacy are interesting to think about. And I think in an American context, when we say right of privacy, we immediately think about Roe versus Wade and this penumbra of the Constitution. I don't know if all of you have investigated that or not, but I grew up in a home with a constitutional attorney, so that was a hot topic at our house. But I just want to point out that this resolution is not a legal question. It's not about, is there a right to privacy in the law? It is an ethical question. It's about whether or not we should respect people's candidates' rights to privacy on a moral level, on an ethical level. So think about it that way. There's definitely a lot of discussion in the literature about the right to privacy, where it originates, if it even exists. And this is definitely a modern idea of the last, 150 years. It's based, I would say, foundationally on the idea that one is one's own private property. Like I own my thoughts and my actions, but to what extent, that's debatable. Again, I would recommend you to check out the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy article, John Stuart Mill's essay on liberty. Locke has these kind of ideas in his second treatise on civil government. And then Justices Warren and Brandeis have an essay that really kind of kicked off this whole idea called The Right to Privacy. That was written in 1890, and that's actually the first time the term was used, at least in an American context, maybe also internationally, I'm not sure. But that's some good kind of starting places to think about the right of privacy. Now, looking at the foundations of the public's right to know, like I said at the beginning, many people view this as a necessary part of democracy. How can the people rule without knowledge? And so the roots of this idea go back to the foundations of democracy in ancient Greek city-states, the whole idea of public debate, public forum, public discussion, voting, and all of that. And then the ideas are taken forward during the Enlightenment. So again, John Locke, those kind of writers, especially the American founding fathers have many things to say about this. So like governments of the people, by the people, for the people require an informed electorate. Another thing to think about under this category is the idea that this is kind of hand in hand with the freedom of the press, because the public's right to know is often fed by the press, the media. Now, thinking about the value clash here, I think that it's pretty obvious just by looking at the resolution. So candidates want to keep certain aspects of their lives private, but does the public have a right to know those things in order to make a better informed vote in a democracy? How much does the public really need to know, though, in order to govern? Where is that line? Just because I become a candidate for public office, do I now give up my right to privacy? And I think one of the central questions is, where should the presumption lie? Should we err on the side of privacy, or should we err on the side of more information? And when we ask that kind of a question, where does the presumption lie? Which one should we presume in favor of? Your answer is going to be found in what you value. And that's why this is called the value debate. So for example, you might say, well, privacy is more important. We should err on the side of privacy because of the value of autonomy. Or on the other side, you might say, well, information about candidates is more important because of the value of democracy. And now you have that debate about which is more important. And how do we know that? How do we know which value is more important, autonomy or democracy? This is where we get into questions of value hierarchies. And I won't dig into that very much, but criteria also helps us decide how to make these decisions. What conditions must be met in order to uphold the autonomy of the individual? What conditions must be met in order to uphold the principles of democracy? And all of this is happening. This resolution gives the context. Keep in mind, it's not just totally abstract. It's within the context of democratic political elections. No rights are absolute. All rights have limits, some might say. You could argue that, right? You could debate that. But so if rights have limits, what limits exist for these rights? And those limits are going to start to form the basis of your criteria. Where is that line between the right of privacy and the right to know in the life of a political candidate? What's included in the public's right to know? What does the public have the right to know? How far does that go? These are the kinds of questions that you'll be digging into with this topic. Then finally, to supportability, there is a ton of information, and I've given you a little bit of a starting point to some of it, a ton of information on the right of privacy, a ton of information on the public's right to know, but not a lot written about the clash of those two values within the context of a political campaign. There's some, but with this resolution, you are really going to have to research those concepts in general and then apply them to the resolution yourself. So that'll be one of the challenges, but I think it's a great challenge, and I know that you'll be up for the challenge. And that's a survey of what I think are some of the key elements of this resolution.
Thank you, Christy. Appreciate it. That's a fantastic overview of what we have in place if this resolution gets picked. Couple of questions, if I may, before we move on to the others. One of the debaters wants to know if there will be enough to debate for the whole year, or will they just be one F value, one neg value for the entire season?
Oh, yeah, I think there'll be plenty to debate for the whole year. I've given a suggestion of probably 6 or 7 values for each side in the white paper, so you can check that out. Mm-hmm. I think the way that the literature, the way that philosophers and political scientists approach the right to know and approach the right to privacy is very different. There's different theories about both of those rights. So I think you'll have a lot of different ideas to choose from.
Mm-hmm. So someone's thinking maybe that the phrase "in democratic elections" is too restraining or constraining. Is there a reason we chose that phrase? Would we consider maybe changing that?
So the phrase, I think, yes, we would consider, at this point, we're still considering word changes. And that's one reason that we're having this webinar before we finalize wording. So we can definitely look at that. That phrase is tied to the idea of the public's right to know. The public has a right to know in the context of making democratic decisions like elections. So that's the idea behind that phrase.
Mm-hmm. So would you say that that there's a place where a debater wants to know where the candidate's privacy would not be violated, but the right to know would be satisfied?
Yes, well, there's always going to be trade-offs, but I do think that this debate comes down to those kinds of questions, to criteria questions like what exactly is the right amount for the public to know and still protect candidate privacy? Where is that line? I think that's the core of this debate. That's the clash. That's where the
yes,
that's the clash.
So, Christy, several people are interested in this question because this resolution will be debated after the 2020 elections. Will it be vulnerable to significant judge bias? And if so, what would you recommend how to deal with that?
Well, I guess I don't really see it as being vulnerable to judge bias after the elections. I feel like we have such frequent elections, not only in the US, but around the world, that it's not usually particular to 1 year. If there's an egregious violation, of course, that's going to get used as an example over and over. But I would recommend them to remember what you said before, that the examples themselves don't prove a philosophical argument. They just illustrate the argument. So that one example does not invalidate a logical argument. So I would encourage them to dig in to the logic and the philosophy, the underlying values and principles and reasons why they hold a position. One example doesn't undo those things. And I think that I know that Joel is going to give a really good response about how dealing with judge bias during his presentation. So I'll defer to what he's going to say there.
Yeah. Couple of things. I see some questions, folks wanting to know where you can find the white paper. Just as a reminder, again, it's on your dashboard on the NCFCA website. If you go under surveys, where the topics are listed where you would vote. Right next to it on the right-hand side is an icon that takes you to the white papers in PDF form that you can download. So maybe one question before we move on to another topic. Does the government always control the right to privacy?
No, I wouldn't say so. But I mean, again, I don't want to come down too
It's
hard on
debatable.
any direction. That's debatable, right? It's debatable. But I think that, like I was saying, this is not primarily a legal question, but an ethical question.
Yeah. Great. Thank you, Christy.
You're welcome.
Appreciate
Thank
it.
you.
We'll come back maybe at the end if we have
Yep.
some more Q&A.
Okay.
So thank you. And we're going to move on to our second presenter. Not a stranger to me at all. We kind of live in the same household. But our second presenter is Caleb Paul. Caleb is an NCFCA alumnus that spent 6 years in the league, debating in both Lincoln Douglas and team policy for several years. While both styles of debate were valuable, he says, in developing communication skills, his personal preference was definitely Lincoln Douglas, and I can vouch for that as well. He also competed in various speech events with extemporaneous as his clear favorite. Since graduating high school, he's gone on to college at East Carolina University and getting a degree in mechanical and electrical engineering, which he's going to complete in December. Despite his involvement in the STEM world for the last several years, he's always thrilled to engage with ideas and philosophy. So with that said, welcome, Caleb. Thanks for being here. Floor is yours.
All right, thank you. Good evening, everyone. I hope everyone's doing well. My internet's been a little bit up and down here, so hopefully it'll hold stable. So yeah, I'm super excited about all three of these topics. This one in particular, although I'm a little biased because I've spent a lot of time working on it. So the topic that I'll be talking about is resolved: the principles of direct democracy ought to be valued above the principles of representative democracy. And so I find that to be a very interesting and a relevant topic. And I want to kind of share with you why I feel that way by really looking at a couple of things. So first, just kind of talking about why a direct and a representative democracy might come into conflict, and specifically why the principles of the two come into conflict, and then go into answering a couple of questions, three main ones, the first of which is specific to this topic, and then the other two are kind of general ideas about any topic, any resolution. So first of all, let's talk about the tension between these ideas, the principle of direct democracy There's a definition provided of democracy from Cambridge English Dictionary, which reads, quote, "the belief in freedom and equality between people, or a system of government based on this belief, in which power is either held by elected representatives or directly by the people themselves," end quote. And so right there, you can kind of already see most of the key terms being defined right off the bat. But the thing that I want to specifically draw out in this, and I think this is really important, is that democracy doesn't just mean government by the will of the people. It's based on that idea, but it's a little bit more specific and maybe more abstract than that, because it's really based on the idea that if you give people in general the right to self-govern, then they will do better in actually self-governing than anyone else will. And so that's sort of the basis for democracy. And then right there in the definition, you see that that's going into why would you want direct democracy. It's pretty simple to see. It makes sense. It flows. If you believe that people want to protect their own freedom and their own equality, that they would consider it paramount, then it makes sense that giving them more power would ultimately help them. But at the same time, we all kind of know from experience that, first of all, not everyone within a particular country or state or city or whatever is going to agree. And even if they do agree, we have no way of determining necessarily whether or not they're right. And we see a lot of instances in which maybe a majority of people are wrong or they want something that's wrong. And so because of that, we have the idea of representative democracy. And that's something that we're all kind of somewhat familiar with, where maybe you vote for elected officials, you vote for people that you would consider experts, and then you have them sort of indirectly so to bring those two things kind of maybe a little bit out of the abstract and into the practical, I want to talk about a couple of, not examples per se, but sort of illustrations. So talking about the Electoral College, for instance, with something that, again, we're pretty familiar with. It's, you know, we vote and we elect delegates, and then they ultimately elect someone for us. And so that's an idea that we would typically associate with a more representative system. And then moving more towards representative principles, you have things like appointments, where an elected official is actually appointing someone for another role in government. So you representation and less direct. And then on the other side of that, you have things like referendums, which are, you know, people just straight up voting on legislation or things like that. But the thing I really want to point out about that is that all three of those examples with kind of, you know, voting, and then you have appointment on this side and referendum on the other, all three of those still have principles of both direct and representative democracy within them. You know, the Electoral College is still based on direct representation. Even appointment is to a certain degree, or sorry, direct democracy, because the people making the appointments are also elected. There's a voice of the people in general in that. And then with referendums, you know, yes, it's people voting directly, but they're doing that on, you know, legislation or ideas that are put forth by elected officials in many cases. So you have kind of this spectrum, and while the two principles aren't necessarily contradictory, and so you have them both at the same time, you're kind of always looking for somewhere to fit on that spectrum and trying to determine which one makes the most sense to run a particular government, whether that's national, state, or whatever. And so as I was thinking about this topic, a lot of questions sort of came to my mind, and as I was researching, I saw a lot of questions kind of come out that I think are relevant. This list is by no means exhaustive. I'm not going to tell you that I know every question that needs to be answered, and I'm also not going to offer you answers to any of these questions, because, you know, that's the point of us engaging in this exercise, is to try and come up with answers to these. And I'll say right now that when we say the will of the people, which people specifically are we referring to? Is it just the majority? You know, is it just people that are educated, etc.? If freedom and equality are of utmost importance always, then why do we need the people to even weigh in on our government? Can we not just let them be free and equal by themselves? Is there a reason that we have to have a government at all? Does everyone have a right to govern everyone else? Should I have a say in all of you, in how you're governed? And should you have a say in how I'm governed? Is that absolute? What happens, for instance, if someone's committed a crime? Does that mean that they no longer have a say in government, or do they still have that? Especially, you know, given the fact that even what constitutes a crime is something that's determined by the people in a democratic society. So, you know, who's to say that they're even right about that? And does that, you know, really take away your right to sort of govern yourself and others? What happens if people are not well educated? If the population as a whole doesn't really know what's best for them, how do you handle that? Isn't it better for the people overall to be governed by people that are well educated, that do understand the issues, that can actually make the right decisions? What happens if the majority's will, or the people's will as a whole, is to harm a minority? You know, this is something that we see in real life. You have, you know, the Rwandan genocide and countless other examples of the majority of people sort of democratically deciding, you might say, to harm a specific subset of them, whether that be racial motivation or whatever. It doesn't really matter. The point is that, you know, you have those kinds of issues that you have to resolve. How do you know if someone is correctly representing the people? Is it just if enough people voted for them? And if so, how do you determine what enough is? What happens if the person that gets elected is just the best option? No one really liked them, but it's just, you know, that's what I had. What happens if I agree with maybe most of what a particular person thinks and values and what they want to put into action, but not all of it? And what if people in general disagree with some things that a person wants to do, but not all of it? How do the people sort of exercise their authority, their sovereignty over an elected official? And then going back to elected officials, do they really hold power over the people if the people are the ones that actually give them the power in the first place? If the sovereignty of and the authority to govern is exclusively from the people, then can they really elect someone that sort of ends up superseding that and creating laws for everyone? So again, these are just some of the, I think, big ideas, some of the core principles. And as you look into various things, various literature, there's a ton of philosophical literature on this subject, and you'll see people sort of debating these ideas and typically coming to a conclusion that you have to fall somewhere in that spectrum, and then they'll be debating maybe more so of where you should fall in it and why, which I think is really cool. I think it's a great opportunity. And that leads me into the first big question that I think maybe a lot of people will have with this, and that is this resolution actually philosophical, or is it more so of a practical topic? And the reason that I think that that might be something that we would initially think is that there could be a tendency to think that this resolution should be all an aristocracy, something like that. And so I want to kind of emphasize that that's really not what we're looking at. When we're talking about this resolution, what we're really looking at is not forms of government, but rather principles of governance. So it's really what we want to be doing is, rather than suggesting let's go with a republic, let's go with this form of government or that, we want to be analyzing human behavior, patterns in human behavior, and then asking some of the questions I had earlier and some others, and then really delving into the specifics of, okay, given that the power to govern is derived from the consent of the governed, how do we translate that consent into actual sort of legal practice? How do we translate that into an actual government? And so the second question that I wanted to talk about is, it's one that again applies to every topic really, and that is there enough support for both sides? And I would say the resounding yes to that. I'll say that my primary source when I was researching this topic, I guess the first source that I had was Alexis de Tocqueville's Democracy in America, which is an excellent book. It's really long, but I would say it's absolutely worth it. Even if this resolution is not baked, it's something that I think would be valuable for anyone to read. And in that book, he kind of wrestles with this idea in a lot of detail. Of course, he's not the only one. He's one in particular. But yeah, there's tons of material on this subject. It's honestly, I mean, if anything, you're going to be overwhelmed by the amount of support there is for both sides. Again, this is a topic that to really come to that sweet spot of exactly where on that spectrum you should be. So I wouldn't worry about that at all, to be honest with you. And then finally, why does this topic matter? Again, that's a question that is relevant no matter what the resolutions are. And I would say that I think this resolution is extremely valuable. I think there's a tremendous value in being able to understand and analyze at a philosophical level with a genuine and sort of reasonable lens the decisions that are being made in government, whether that's our national government, our local governments, international governments, whatever it is. It's something that we all need to learn how to do. Most of you guys as students, aren't quite old enough to vote yet, but you will be soon. And even if you can't vote, you're never too young to influence people's thinking. But if you're going to influence people's thinking, you need to make sure that you understand your own thinking and that you have good, solid thoughts behind your ideas. And I think it's pretty common, maybe, at least in today's culture, to get kind of overwhelmed by the just insane amount of value-oriented issues that have to be decided in a government. And instead of actually dealing with those at a philosophical level, we just kind of capitulate and we just go, you know, based on what other people say. Do people say it's conservative? Did they say it's liberal? Did they say rather than actually engaging with the ideas? And, you know, people will throw out, you know, this is biblical, this isn't biblical, a lot of times even without any strong support for that. And so I think this topic gives you an excellent framework to really start to delve deep into the reasoning and philosophy behind democracy. I think most of us would say that in some sense we value democracy, but maybe not all of us have a good idea of why and how that should work. And so I think that with this topic, there's a great chance to really get into that. And I think you'll have a lot of fun, and I think you'll learn a lot and be challenged.
Thank you, Caleb. Just a quick note before we get into a couple of questions here coming your way. You were lagging on and off, as you're doing right now, unfortunately. Amy Joy said, I'm hoping you're hearing me, that if the lag continues, you can maybe turn off your video. That maybe will help with the bandwidth. Or you can just come join me here.
Yeah.
Okay. All right, great. So question for you. Is a balance, I know you love this question, is a balanced neg a valid approach to the resolution? Or would we maybe see a when in conflict clause added?
Yeah, that is a good question. I can't speak to necessarily whether or not we would want to add a when in conflict clause. I think that's something we could definitely think about. But in terms of, you know, thinking of it philosophically, I would say that definitely balanced neg doesn't make a lot of sense. The thing is that running a balanced neg is basically you're saying that, you know, these two things should be exactly balanced. And to be honest with you, from my perspective and from everything that I've read, that's not even a valid statement. Like there's not a bright line metric, I guess, that you could use to say, you know, direct and representative democracy are exactly of the same value, because they do exist on that spectrum. And so you can easily, both sides, AF and neg, can support the idea that a real government should have elements of both and principles of both. But to say that they're exactly equivalent in value is just, I think it's unreasonable, personally.
Okay. What do you think about someone that says that there are potentially very few arguments on either side and the resolution could be very narrow?
I would say that from my research, I would say that is maybe kind of the opposite of how I would see it. I think that this resolution has maybe even a wider spectrum than some other ones, not necessarily the ones that we're talking about tonight, but some different ones that I've seen in different places. And so if you go through the white paper, there's a little bit more. I don't want to go into, you know, all of the various ways that you can look at it, but I will say that it's the thing that makes it to me quite broad is that you don't necessarily have to look at it from the same perspective. There's a lot of perspectives that you can use to support why we need more direct or why we need more representative. That's, you know, things like tyranny, that's things like rule of law, things like justice, qualification, credibility, things like that, accountability.
Okay, I think we lost you, Caleb. While he's getting back, Christy, if I could ask you a question that sort of is a more general question. The question is sort of, I think it tied to all of the topics. How do we keep the debate in a philosophy kind of format? How do we avoid, you know, specific arguments or examples and illustrations oriented arguments? Can you address that question at a general macro level, please?
Sure. Well, I mean, it's up to each individual debater to argue philosophically rather than just using examples. But I feel that debaters can be very successful by focusing on the why, like you said at the beginning. Why should we value direct democracy over representative? Why? Why should we value, privacy over the public's right to know? What is the why? And the answer to the why question is the value itself. It's what you value. That's why, because this thing is so valuable. And then you just keep asking why. Why is it more valuable? And that's, you can answer that with your criteria. And how would that be applied to real life? And that's the chain of thinking that helps you get into that philosophical mode. Answer that question, why? Don't just give a bunch of examples of what, but really, and then those are questions you can ask of your opponent, even in cross-ex, like, why does this matter? Why is that true? Why is this valuable?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, great. Thank you. And if I could also add to that, folks, these kind of questions are going to be addressed in much more depth, and a whole lot more time will be available during our summit, especially the summit intensive. You're going to have some fantastic speakers and thinkers and debaters, including some of the panel here, where they will be addressing those kind of questions and getting into those kind of questions a lot more. So please consider those as well. Okay, so I think let's do this and move to the third topic. We'll come back and address some questions at the end, if we could. So thank you again, Caleb, appreciate that. So let me go ahead and introduce our final speaker. That's Joel Erickson. Joel has coached NCFCA clubs and competitors for 4 years and received numerous accolades in British parley debate, moot court, and moot trial. After graduating from Wheaton, he currently works in financial aid and helps coach collegiate debate while frantically studying for the LSAT. He's passionate about time with friends and family, Kierkegaard, and national parks. I have had the pleasure of getting to know Joel as we've worked on these resolutions, and it has been an absolute joy getting to know Joel. So, Joel, please, the floor is yours.
Great. Hey everyone, I'm going to be talking about the third resolution today, which is resolved immigration is a human right. I'm not going to regurgitate everything I said in the white paper, but I'm going to attempt to structure this discussion around 4 primary points. First of all, we're going to talk about the relevance of the resolution. Secondly, supportability of the resolution. Third, the breadth of the resolution. You're thinking, oh, we heard all these things before. And then fourth, and finally summarize it with our vision for LD. And I'm going to intersperse this with some of the relevant criticism that y'all have directed against this resolution and has been circulating around the debate community as well. So first things first, we'll talk about the relevance of the immigration resolution. I think immigration as a subject is indisputably relevant. The statistical evidence demonstrates that it's one of the most salient political issues now, surging not only in the United States, but also in democracies across the world. And anything that's shaping our political discourse in such a consequential way is going to have massive educational benefits. So the relevance is immense. However, the issue with uber relevant topics like immigration is that there seems to be a positive correlation between relevance and bias, which makes sense, that the more important a subject is, the more entrenched in their opinions people are going to be on the issue because they know something about it. So I want to give you 3 things to mitigate any concerns that you potentially have about bias. First is the historical precedent regarding other NCFCA LD resolutions that have received criticisms of bias. Primarily thinking back to like the economic freedom versus economic equity resolution, this encountered a lot of similar criticism about bias, but we found that the results ended up unfolding in a fairly balanced manner. which demonstrates that even if NCFC debaters are initially concerned about bias, ultimately they're able to creatively circumvent the potentially stronger preconditions of their judges. So I think that looking at the historical trends in the NCFCA should alleviate some of your concerns about that. Secondly, is there are a lot of really effective ways of mitigating bias through framing. Think about bias as mostly like an irrational thing. Like it's kind of like a gag reflex that you have to a topic, which means that you can use a lot of tactics to frame things out. In this debate round, I think everyone pretty much agrees that the bias tilt is going to skew negative, which means that that's good for the affirmative debater because the affirmative gets the opportunity to frame the resolution. Also, and we're going to touch on this later, the literature base like almost unanimously concurs that immigration as a human right does not equal open borders. So you can frame a lot of the negative associations out of the debate round from the get-go. It took me about 2 minutes to persuade a solidly neg-leaning relative that affirmative has a solid case for this motion. So I think that there are a lot of framing techniques that are at your disposal for eliminating bias in this res. But third and finally is the educational benefit that emerges from debating a slightly more controversial resolution like this. Because our mission is to enable you to communicate in the real world, which is just inevitably tampered by bias. We think it's important for you to be able to navigate charged political issues courteously and well. The debate resolutions in college where I feel like I experienced the most personal growth and like the most satisfaction and victory were the ones that were much more heavily biased than this resolution ever could aspire to be. And I was on the opposing side of the bias. So in other words, to summarize the relevance point, massive educational benefits. We think the bias, like we're going to acknowledge that there's probably more bias here than with the other ones, but we think that it's still like a kind of a marginal bias that shouldn't necessarily be a factor in your decision making. So that's point one, relevance. We'll talk about point two, supportability. There are, so first of all, the literature base for this resolution is just massive. And there are numerous argument patterns swirling around in the philosophical ether, if you will. In fact, the expert consensus slightly favors affirmative, for the record. There are like kind of two primary ways like this topic area is going to go. There's the like meta-ethical way, which is where you're asking questions about the foundation of rights. Like what are rights? What actually constitutes a right? Where do we get our rights? How do we limit our rights? And then there's the more normative ethical trajectory, where you're connecting rights, the immigration as a human right, to other discussions of rights. So like the freedom of association or property rights or national sovereignty. These are all like massive literature bases in and of themselves that you get to access. So from a supportability standpoint, the resolution is doing fairly well. The criticism that I've heard about supportability regarding this resolution is that the res is just like unequivocally neg, that there is no affirmative argumentation. And I think this stems kind of from two ideas that I want to address. The first idea is that it's the resolution being like unequivocally negative slanted kind of stems from this sovereignty-centric, social contract-y, quasi-libertarianism that a lot of debaters gravitate to because of its internal coherency. But think about it this way. The social contract, and this would be an affirmative argument, by the way, you could deny this. The social contract, just because people agree on something in a social contract doesn't mean that it like doesn't violate rights. So for instance, the majority of it in the social contract could decide to pass a law that say commits genocide against a minority or like takes all the property of a minority. Like that would violate their right to life and their right to liberty, even if the social contract agreed to it. So simply because the social contract decides on more stringent immigration laws doesn't mean those laws aren't harming rights. The second thing is conflating affirmative with open borders. That if you're going to grant a right to immigration, that right must be absolute. However, like, because as Christy mentioned in her presentation, rights are limited on a fairly regular basis, but that doesn't detract from them being a right. There's no reason to suggest that if we're going to grant a right to immigration, that means we have to let terrorists into our country. Like, you can still acknowledge a right to immigration, you can still confer the status of right to immigration, and it doesn't necessarily make that right absolute. So I think there are plenty of arguments for affirmative, and the literature base reflects that, and the presumption that this negative resolution is just one-sided means people haven't like stepped outside their paradigm enough to consider the implications of that. All right. Third, the breadth of this resolution. The question for breadth is, will this resolution be able to sustain an entire season of competition? There's been a blog post circulating around that suggests that because there are only so many ways to measure human rights, that this resolution isn't going to be viable for the entire season. We think that a better metric for measuring viability for the season or breadth is to look at the literature base. As I mentioned, the literature base is fairly extensive regarding this resolution. Like, when you take inventory of it, you'll see that a literature base that can sustain several years of philosophical dialogue can probably survive a couple months of NCFCA competition. So I just don't think viability is a concern with the number of experts that are creatively interpreting this debate. Fourth and finally, let's talk about the vision for LD and how this impacts a couple other criticisms that have been ventured against this resolution. We've received the critiques that this resolution will reduce examples to quote unquote barely more than illustrations, meaning that this resolution is overly philosophical, or this resolution isn't going to be suitable for young students because of its complexity. As we commented at the beginning, I'm speaking on behalf of the entire NCFCA resolution committee here. We want to provide LD as a forum for more mature, sophisticated philosophical argumentation. And we think this resolution is perfectly situated to do that. So if you espouse either of those two concerns about examples or younger students being slightly disadvantaged, like, those concerns stem from a different vision of LD than the one we're trying to project here. So ultimately, it's for these reasons that we ultimately think that a lot of this criticism that this resolution has garnered has been ill-founded, and that it's going to be a massively educational and politically relevant topic area for you to explore.
Great. Thank you, Joel. Appreciate that. Fantastic. Couple of questions for you. There are quite a few are coming this way, so we'll try to squeeze in as many as we can. So is it possible under this resolution to say if immigration is a human right, then governments who stand for human rights cannot persecute or take measures to stop illegal immigrants?
I think the question of the particularity of immigration laws is an interesting question that occurs at the tail end of your research. Obviously, because the right isn't absolute, there will be still some immigration that is justifiably legal. However, it's not ultimately a legal question. It's fundamentally a philosophical question. So you resolve the philosophical dispute, and then you work out the legal implications afterward. It's like having the right to liberty. You have the right to liberty, but you can't exercise that right in an untrammeled fashion. We acknowledge you have the right, and then we impose limitations on it afterwards.
Okay, great. So there have been several questions here related to the use of scripture, essentially. And I think it comes in here maybe more so than the others is, you know, aren't human rights given, those rights given by God? And that's our position. How do you argue against that? And what's the place of, or can we use scripture and so on? Christy, if I could, I know you've talked about this many times, and do you want to take that, Christy, please?
Sure. I'd be happy to. So this, I wrote about this in the LD value curriculum, and perhaps we could release that bit as an article. That would be a good idea, probably. So you just have to be careful when you're using scripture to support your arguments, because there's two different contexts you need to think about. First of all, the context that we are a Christian organization, and if you mishandle scripture, you can really offend or place your opponent in a really difficult position where they might feel as if you're attacking them with scripture and saying that their side is against God and against the Bible, and you have the Bible on your side and you're proving they're wrong with the Bible, and vote for me, I'm the one who agrees with God, and my opponent is evil and against God. So that's where we want to be really careful about not making the opponent feel like that, because really your opponent is always your ally. The two of you are iron sharpening iron. You're on the same side of learning debate and learning the skills. So you don't want to do that to an opponent. And then the second context you need to think about is the context of debate simulating the public square. That this is supposed to be, it's not exactly the public square, but it's supposed to simulate that, and we invite in members of the public to come and judge. And so, in my opinion, you can use the Bible in the same way that you use it in the public square. That it's not a trump card that you can use to beat people over the head with, but it is wisdom that a lot of people are willing to accept when used in the context of the public square. So just as you might use the Bible to support arguments at your job or when discussing things with the neighbor, it is a book of wisdom that a lot of people respect, but keep in mind that not everybody in the world agrees that scripture is authoritative. And we need to be respectful of that kind of audience as well.
Great. Thank you, Christy. Appreciate it.
Sure.
Joel, back to you, if I could. There are several questions, and I'm trying to get to, I think, the underlying common question that's tying several of these questions is really, how can you really make an argument against, for allowing immigration as a human right, which sort of means that, hey, that's like saying someone knocks on your door and you're saying that you have to let them in. And really it's tied to, are we talking about legal versus illegal immigration? So it's really kind of several questions are tied to that. And if you could address that from the LD debate perspective, please.
Sure thing. I don't want to deprive you all of the joy of researching this, but I'll tell you where to go. So the source Christy mentioned a lot, Stanford Encyclopedia, wholeheartedly recommend. There is an article on immigration that presents in sort of a nutshell the affirmative, like a myriad of arguments for the affirmative and negative here. And that is contested directly. There are arguments about property and arguments about democracy that can directly dismantle that example.
Okay, great. Can you talk about difference? Is there a difference between a fundamental right and a human right? And are we making that difference here?
A fundamental right and a human right. I would say that any difference between those two is probably semantic. The terms are, human rights, the one that's used more in the literature. Fundamental seems to be a consequence or an attribute of human rights. I wouldn't get hung up on the terminology of whether something is fundamental or human. Those two things seem to be coextensive. Okay.
If rights can be held and yet be granted or denied in certain conditions, limited conditions, what separates rights from privileges?
That's a really good question. I'm going to articulate a personal opinion here. Like the other two members of the committee have been saying, these are the sorts of things that are debatable. So just because I say something doesn't mean that if this resolution is chosen is now the definitive law of the land for your rounds, but this is a position you can make. That ultimately a kind of intuitive test is the difference between a right and a privilege, is whether or not someone deserves it. So for example, I may really like ice cream, but that doesn't necessarily mean I have a right to ice cream. Like I might have a privilege to enjoy ice cream. But there's a pretty strong case out there that your ability to like identify with a particular group of people, like to move, like let's say your country kicks you out, where you're gonna go. Like there's a pretty intuitive case that you deserve some kind of association there, which would qualify as more of a right than a privilege. So I think just because things can be limited does not relegate them to the status of mere privileges. But again, that's kind of like an intuitive soft answer. I recognize that there are logical loopholes in that all 172 of you are going to exploit. So
great, thank you. Okay, all right. I think we're going to pause for now with the Q&A at this point in time, and I'm going to hand it over to Mrs. Cromer, who has some exciting announcement about giveaways.
Absolutely. We love giving away things. Our sponsor tonight is the University of Northwestern at St. Paul. And I know we're all going to miss being there for the national championship this year, but they've given us a great treat to share with you tonight. It's a University of Northwestern swag pack that has some really exciting things inside. And the winner of that swag pack tonight is Thaddeus Burson. So Thaddeus, if you would email the office at ncfca.org and give them your information, your contact information, that'd be great. We'll get that right out to you. And all of you are now entered into a drawing for an iPad that was also generously donated by the University of Northwestern. And we're going to draw a winner from Monday night's webinar attendees and tonight's webinar attendees at 1 o'clock tomorrow Central Time on Facebook and Instagram. So we're going to have some fun and see who's going to win our iPad.
Great. Okay. Do we have a few more minutes for some more questions here?
Let's take about 3 more questions, Robbie, and then we'll end for the evening.
Okay, that sounds great. So I'm gonna swing back to you, Caleb. A question for you. When arguing the principles of direct democracy versus representative democracy, would it be possible to contend that the results of one form is more harmful than the other?
The results. That's an excellent question. Wow. Yeah. So the thing about that is that when you're talking about philosophy.
Oh no.
That was going to be a profound answer. I'm most certain of it. All right. You want to ask a different question?
Christy, you wanna take that? Caleb, you wanna come join me here?
Sure. Yeah, I can head in there.
Christy, go ahead.
Well, I can anticipate a little bit of what Caleb's going to say, but I'd love to hear his perspective. Philosophy absolutely has practical implications. Like, we don't just philosophize in a vacuum. It's for the purpose of making applications, but like Joel said, those are secondary questions. I do think it is important, though, to think about the impacts of future decision making. But is Caleb almost there?
He's getting here. Yeah.
Okay. I know he has a really good answer for this. He's coming.
Mrs. Shipe wants to hear your answer.
Hey,
Yeah.
hey guys. I'm over here.
Hey,
Hopefully,
Hey.
you can hear a little better now. Yeah, so what I was going to say before I was rudely interrupted by my internet. So when you're talking about political philosophy, more so than maybe ethical philosophy or some other areas that are more abstract, you're going to have some sort of practical issues. But even within practical philosophy, you still have to talk about why, which goes back to what Mrs. Shipe was saying earlier. Because really, if you look at something practically, right, and it's something that a government has put into place, and then you see the implications of it, those implications, you really have to have some sort of standard for how you actually apply it. You can't just say, this happened, therefore this one is better, because you have to still weigh that philosophically. Just because something happened doesn't mean that thing is good or bad, and you still have to get into that. So saying that, something is applied and therefore, because of the way it's applied, it's better or worse, still requires you to get into the philosophy of why.
And let me just add to that, because yes, very good, Caleb. This really gets into the ideas of criteria and philosophical underpinnings. So because philosophers are talking about things from the perspective of what will lead to the most human good, what is the good, and what will lead to human thriving, whether you see that good as the greatest good to the greatest number, or producing the most virtuous character, or adherence to a moral code. There's different ways of looking at that. I'm just mentioning some of the biggest philosophical criteria that are out there. But that's really what philosophers are all about, is answering the question, what will bring the most good for humankind?
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you. Caleb, can you summarize the central principle idea, or really the primary clash between principles of representative democracy and direct democracy?
Yeah, so I would say, and this kind of goes back to what I was saying earlier, but it's basically the way that I see it, and again, this is something that you have to research and really understand on your own. But I would say that, given that we have the same sort of, let's say, worldview or overarching view that democracies are valuable, as in, the equality and freedom of the people is paramount, and that people are the best ones to protect that. Given that, is that something that is best achieved by a more direct or a more representative system? So really you have to look at, how do people act, why do they act, and where do they get the authority to govern, and then use that to sort of answer that question.
Okay, great. Joel, we're going to swing to you. What do you think about, well, can you address, is the resolution addressing the right of the people to leave their country, or that other countries must let people into their country?
The latter. The right to emigration with an E, which is the right to leave your country, different from immigration, entering a country. The right to emigration is fairly uncontested.
Okay. Any thoughts on how and if the COVID crisis will potentially impact this resolution if it's chosen in rounds?
The immigration one?
Yes.
I doubt it. Simply because, like, another rather commonly accepted tentative rights theory is that rights can be suspended in times of certain national emergencies. That's to make no judgment on whether the most recent executive decision to suspend immigration for 60 days is a good one. Like, there's evidence that that could be a good idea. There's evidence that immigration isn't necessarily a contributing factor to increasing COVID-19 in the US. I doubt it would be more than an application that would probably be increasingly irrelevant by the second tournament.
Okay. This question sort of applies to specifically from the debaters talking about more for the democracy resolution and the immigration one. So Christy, if you would take this, is really talking about, the typical problem that we see is one of debaters talking past each other rather than actually interacting and clashing with the same ideas from two different sides. And they're feeling like, because of these resolutions being the way they are and so complex, especially for new LDers, what do you think? Is that potentially a bigger problem? Is there anything we can do to mitigate that or help with that?
Well, yes. First of all, I would really recommend that everyone attend the summit. That we have a free summit coming up in the summer that's going to get more about the basics of value debate and how to approach it. And then the following week, we're going to have an intensive that's going to be topic specific. So we're going to have a lot of topic experts and value debate experts who will be talking about the actual resolution that has been chosen and how to approach it and how to think about it. And we'll have a sample case and all of that kind of stuff. So we're going to hopefully get all those good resources to you. But I would also say, if you have a particularly young debater who would struggle with philosophical content, I would advise that you start them with policy debate, which is much more concrete. And then in a couple of years, they'll probably be ready for value debate. That would be my advice.
Okay, thank you very much. I appreciate it. And that's a really, really great note for us to bring this amazing, interesting session to a close here. Again, I want to thank you and Caleb and Joel. Thank you guys so very much for all the work you've done, and even for being here today and taking these questions. So thank you. Have a great evening. I'll hand it over back to Amy Joy. Yeah.
Great, thanks so much. Hey, we just wanted to make a few announcements this evening before you leave. If you enjoyed tonight's session with our debate committee, we have another special treat for you. Our friends at Heritage Foundation have enlisted the help of 6 of their scholars who are going to speak on each of the resolutions. So join us on Monday, April 27th at 6:30 p.m. Central Time for the Heritage Foundation Policy Resolution webinar. And then join us Thursday, April 30th at 6:30 p.m. Central Time for the Value Resolution webinar. So you can watch tomorrow for an email from the League, and there'll be links for those events. The debate resolution voting closes on Friday, May 1st at 11:59 p.m. So I do want to encourage you to keep looking at those white papers, look at some of the different resources that the committee provided for you so that you can make an informed decision. And then we'll be back together on May 7th for our book club session. So be watching for all of these great events, and do make plans to attend the summit this summer. Our workshop is July 27th through the 31st, and the intensive will be August 3rd through the 7th. If you have any questions about the events, you're welcome to email me at amyjoytofty@ncfca.org. And again, just thank you to all of our debate committee. Just the work that you have put into this is such a blessing to all of our affiliates, and we appreciate all that you do. So have a great evening, and we will see you back on Monday.